I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, I'm Steve.
Hello, I'm Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to Season 2 of the Innkeepers podcast.
We're so glad you are with us. We hope you've enjoyed Season 1. And we are definitely looking forward to this season. And we have a lot of great interviews lined up. I'm super excited. We're interviewing Lauren Wells with TCK Training. And Connie Beefus we're talking with her about surviving your first missionary term.
We will be speaking with Calvin and Julie Tadema about the significance of forgiveness. Also, we're talking with a missions pastor, Brian Herwagen, and Brian's going to talk to us about missionaries and their sending church.
And we also have the opportunity to interview John Leverington and talk with him about marriage and cross-cultural stress. Yeah,
so those are a few of the interviews that we have coming up, and I know there's going to be 8 altogether. And whenever we record an interview, we have a lot of fun getting to know the guest and finding out more about their story and their experiences. And we trust that the 8 episodes that we've put up already are episodes that are going to be helpful, useful, encouraging, and we believe that Season 2 will be the same.
Yeah, and we invite you to share with your friends and anyone you know who might benefit from this podcast. You can find us on our website at sanctuaryin.org or all the major podcast platforms. People can look for The Innkeepers. Or you can find us on our YouTube channel and just search for Sanctuary Inn, and our podcast should pop right up.
Well, here's to a great second season, so thanks for listening. We have the opportunity to interview Lauren Wells. Cara, give us a little bit of information about Lauren.
Yeah. Lauren Wells, she is the founder and director of TCK Training, and she is the author of Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, a Practical Guide to Preventative Care. And she has a brand new book out called The Grief Tower. She specializes in practical and preventative care for third culture kids and their families. She has worked with over 1,000 parents and their TCK caregivers, and she's had the opportunity to train about 60 different organizations as well. Lauren herself spent her developmental years in Tanzania, East Africa, and now she lives in South Carolina with her husband and her 2 children.
And I know Lauren is working at getting a lot of resources available for those people who care for TCKs, and she'll share a little bit more about that in the interview, and we'll link to it in the podcast as well. But she's recognized the fact that there's a lot that parents and organizations can do before these kids and families ever go to the field, and giving them tools to process all the things that they're going to be experiencing. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Lauren.
Yep. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, Lauren, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So as we just start out, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your own story and your life experience as a missionary kid, third culture kid. And maybe we should back up and define what a third culture kid is for maybe our guests who've never heard that term before.
Yeah, so the definition of a third culture kid is that somebody who has spent their developmental years outside of their parents' passport country or country of origin. So those would be missionary kids, diplomat kids, anybody who is living some of their developmental years outside their parents' passport country. So my TCK story and background is that we moved from California to Tanzania, East Africa, right after I turned 13. So I became what we would call a third culture kid or a TCK quite a bit later in childhood. I had no idea what I was getting into. I was honestly really upset about it at first. I was about to go into junior high. I was really excited and found out right before the end of the school year that we were going to be moving to Africa over the summer. And at first that sounded really exciting. And then the closer we got to our leaving date, the more terrible the idea sounded. And I was having a really hard time. But after we got there, I integrated really deeply into the culture. We lived in a Tanzanian neighborhood. So I was out in the community all the time, sitting with the Tanzanian mamas, learning how to cook Tanzanian food and speak Swahili, and walking to they're called dukas, they're like little places to buy your eggs and that sort of thing. And realizing that unless you can speak Swahili, you can't buy what you need. And so picked up the language really quickly and was just really invested in the culture. So I became a third culture kid. We came back to the United States to switch organizations, which is a story in and of itself. My sophomore year in high school. So I spent my sophomore and junior year of high school in California in a public school, and then went back to Africa for my senior year of high school. And my parents were still there the whole time I was in university and even a couple years after. And so I would go back to visit them on summer breaks and that sort of thing.
So you kind of did a sink or swim deal as a teenager.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, that's pretty unusual that, I know we met a young lady when we were in Slovakia, and she came over at 16 with her parents, and the mission almost didn't send them because they said, oh, that she will never adjust. But she did great, and she had been homeschooled and everything. There was just no issue there. And I think with you, sounds like you really adapted well.
I did. And I think part of it is context related. So now I work with a lot of families. And so I get those questions all the time. Is 13 an okay age to take a kid overseas and that sort of thing? And I really think in a lot of ways it depends on the context. And what we had going for us and what I had going for me as far as adapting was that we lived in an environment that really required that. And so I had to get out into the community. I had to learn the language, that sort of thing. And we lived also there in an era where there wasn't easily accessible internet. You had to drive to the internet cafe. So it wasn't like I was able to live a internet United States life while living in Africa. I was completely immersed, and that makes a huge difference. I think I know a lot of teenage TCKs living overseas now who are able to pretty well disconnect, and that does make the experience very different.
Yeah, I've heard those stories as well of just that internet connection pretty much crippling a TCK or even a missionary's ability to immerse themselves and learn the language and the culture because they've not really emotionally left their country that they were from. So what would you say are some of your favorite memories or just the highlights of being a TCK for you?
So a big overarching one is the freedom. I had so much freedom in Africa, and I'm such an independent person, sometimes to a fault. And I loved being able to go walk everywhere that I wanted to. I had a friend who lived in the neighborhood, and I could walk to her house, and it was like a mile walk through a creek and a field and a jungle. And it was just this really cool experience of like, wow, this is so neat that I get to just do my thing. And I loved every second of that. We also had all the typical really neat African experiences we had this really cool old Land Rover that had an open top. And so we would go on safari quite often because it was really easily accessible where we were. And we would sit on top of the Land Rover. And so I have all sorts of memories of that. We had our tent. So we camped in the Serengeti one time, and I'm not sure who thought that was a good idea, but somehow we ended up camping in the Serengeti in a tent. And our tent at one point was surrounded by lions, and they were pawing at the tent. And I remember thinking, like, I know what Daniel felt like in the lion's den. And this is this is one of those experiences that I am hating right now, but I probably am going to love later. And a lot of those really neat memories that you just can't get most anywhere else.
that is definitely memorable to have lions pawing at your tent. Yeah, and that sense of freedom, I do think that in a lot of places in the world, kids do have a little more just that independence and freedom, and the community maybe watches out a little bit more for the kids, and yeah, so that's special.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the hardest challenges or struggles that you faced?
Yeah. So our first couple of years in Africa were really hard. I talk a lot when I do workshops and trainings, and just wrote a book on it, the idea of the grief tower and how TCKs end up having a lot of grief inducing experiences and losses, and those stack up over their time overseas. And those first couple of years that we were in Africa, it was like blocks piling upon blocks before we could even realize that the first one was on it. It was just one thing after another. So many people dying. We had a little boy who lived with us who eventually died of AIDS, and we cared for him all the way through that point. We had some experiences of like seeing a thief taken off by a mob. They put a tire around him, put gasoline over him, lit him on fire, and he burned to death right in front of me. And so there's things like that happened, and I think those in and of themselves are challenges, absolutely. But I think the biggest challenge was that there was no way to process all of that. And anytime that it felt like I would bring it up, especially as a teenager, in the TCK community, it was like, oh yeah, that's normal. That's just what happens.
Yeah.
And so it almost made it almost like, well, this isn't worth grieving. This isn't that big of a deal. And so that ends up making everything be stuffed, right? Because then you end up thinking, well, clearly I'm the only one who's affected by this, so I just need to stuff it and get over it. And not having a healthy way of processing those things, I think, was overall the biggest challenge. One thing that was leading into that, a really big challenge, is that we also were the only family that our organization had ever sent to live overseas. And so we didn't have a healthy level of support, or really any support. My parents didn't know what a TCK was, how to really help us process through any of these things. And so it just built up. And it took a long time for it to be resolved. It wasn't until I was an adult sitting in a counselor's office that I realized, oh, these things actually were a big deal, and they really have impacted me. And I really do need to process this grief that I just stuffed down for so long. So I think that's definitely the biggest challenge.
Well, it sounds like one of the big struggles was that you weren't given permission to grieve some really hard things.
Can you tell us a little bit about your TCK training that you do and how it directly grew out of your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the time when TCK training kind of began. I was developing TCK programs for an organization called Culture Bound, and developing programs in culture learning and language acquisition, and working on the pre-field side of families going to live overseas. And it was also at this time that I was in really intensive trauma counseling for a lot of the stuff that I just mentioned and more that I had struggled with and dealt with in my overseas life. And I remember that there was this one point, a book had just come out called Misunderstood by Tanya Crossman, and she was also releasing all sorts of other statistics that she was finding. She's a researcher about adult TCKs. And one of those was that 80% of TCKs struggle with depression and anxiety. And I fall into that 80% in the anxiety category. And I was talking to so many families and so many parents who were about to embark on this journey to live overseas with their kids, and having this ethical dilemma of, do I actually think this is a good idea? And if it's not, then I need to figure out what else I'm going to do with my life, because if there is not a way to prevent a lot of these things, then I can't do this job. I cannot promote this if there's not a counteract to a lot of these challenges, to even that fact that 80% of adult TCKs struggle with depression and anxiety. If there is not an active way to bring that number down, then what are we doing? And so I got to a point, and through a lot of prayer and a lot of just seeking the Lord on what does this look like? I believe that missions is valuable. I believe that the missionary life is good and that so much has come from my TCK experience that was positive, but what do I do with this? And realize that there can be a preventive approach that had not really been implemented, or not in a big picture been implemented in the TCK care world. Everything was fairly reactive, or was a one time, so you go for 1 week to get this education and then we won't see you again until you're 18 and on your way to college, that sort of thing. And realizing that a lot of the problem was coming from this lack of proactivity and this lack of preventive care. And so I began to write a lot about that and was blogging a lot under a blog called TCK Training, which is how that all came about. And I was writing about practical ways that parents could have conversations with their kids about having permission to grieve, or emotional health, or how can you be empowered as a parent. And I had so many parents and TCK caregivers reaching out and saying, nobody is telling us that we are capable of this. People are acting like the TCK education needs to come from the outside. And we didn't realize as parents that we could actually know and teach our kids this stuff ourselves.
Okay.
And so that became something that I grew to be really passionate about, is empowering parents and then empowering organizations and TCK caregivers to provide this preventive care, but also to empower parents to provide it. Because at the end of the day, those kids that you had in your training all day long, they're going back to their parents.
Right.
And they really need to know how to continue that education and ask their kids about their emotions and all those different things. So TCK Training officially started as an organization about 1.5 years ago. It moved from a blog to now workshops and resources and education and training of all types. And we can talk about that more a little bit later. But that was the heart of it, is how can we really be proactive about TCK care?
Yeah. I appreciate the idea of the proactive. It's sort of like doing preventative medicine. It's like if you exercise and watch what you eat and so on, chances are you're going to be in better physical health. And so the idea of emotional health and spiritual health as a family, and then giving the parents the tools to talk to their kids, because parents want the best for their kids. But so often they just don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that in one of your books you just mentioned. It's like, well, I'm supposed to ask my kids something, but what exactly do I ask them? And so you are giving them some very specific, literally you're helping them write scripts so that they can talk to their kids, which is great.
Yeah. And I feel like this isn't something that we've realized in spiritual and the discipleship side of parents are taking that. It's not just in Sunday school at church or whatever. Parents are responsible for the discipleship of their kids, right?
That's right.
So that in the same vein, it's not just the agency or the camps or whatever it is that's provided for your Missionary Kid TCK that's supposed to provide the care, but the parents are there with the kid and experiencing, and it may even be teaching the parents how to take care of themselves better, and so they can even model this. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that parent care piece, like you were just saying, is a huge part of it as well. And one thing that I focus a lot on is whole family unit care, because we know that the health of kids is directly impacted by the health of the parents.
Right.
So you can teach the kids all you want to all day long, but if the parents have unhealthy emotional patterns, that's what's going to be passed on to the kids, not what you told them one time. And so it's really important to be educating both sides. And that's something that I often do.
That is, I'm sure, in the long haul, it'll be a much more powerful and effective way of providing TCK care. So what have been some of the common themes you have seen in your work with TCKs and their families?
Yeah, so the biggest common theme is actually what you had mentioned, of this lack of permission to grieve, but not only that, but a lack of understanding of how to help our kids do that well and effectively. I think at a parent's heart, especially if they know they they've been through as a family, or their kids have been through a lot of really hard things. They want to help their kids through that well, but they just don't know how to. And so they end up doing things like downplaying the things that they're saying, or saying a really positive thing like, well, but you have so many great friends over here. I know you miss those ones, but think about these ones. Or just having these responses that are really automatic and sometimes just feel natural, but aren't very helpful. And that is definitely a pattern that I've seen. And that just reiterates to the TCK, yeah, stuff this. You don't need to grieve this. It's not important. Keep it down. And what we see with that is that it ends up stacking up over time, and it doesn't just stay down. It doesn't just go away. It eventually will topple over and make a big mess. And so it's really important that we're teaching these parents how to help their kids learn how to grieve. And so that's one pattern that I've seen. Another pattern that I've seen is that concept of emotions and TCKs, that we all come from a family of origin, and sometimes that family of origin did a really great job about teaching us how to use emotions words and how to know what we're feeling and all those different things. And sometimes it didn't. And so a lot of the patterns that I have been seeing, which kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, is that parents themselves were not educated on these things. They didn't have a great example of how to express emotions. And so now they're starting from scratch and figuring out essentially how to end a generational cycle and do it for their kids. And so that just requires a lot of intentionality because it's not going to come intuitive to them.
Yeah, when I think about, I was talking to someone the other day. My dad was raised on a pretty steady diet of John Wayne movies, and so you're tough and you just gut it out, and you just make it go. You just it's the way life is, and there's not a lot of room for feelings or discussion about feelings. So, yeah. We want to talk a little bit about the resources that you've published recently, and in the Grief Tower, which is we'll go back to the first one, but you talk about the shutdown responses. And I just made a note to myself that those responses by parents often invalidate the feelings that the kids are having. Like, oh, well, you should, you downplay, you talk about that, defending, and so on. And I have to say, when I read that through, I was somewhat convicted. So thank you for that. Anyway, I appreciate that, because it is so easy just to have an automatic response and say, oh, well, it's really okay. Or, yes, you left your friends behind, but look, you have new friends here. And not really validating the fact that they're experiencing the loss of a dear friend. And anyway, that's not, just not, they don't get to value that. They don't get to grieve that like we've been talking about. So.
Yeah, I feel like one of the challenges is that we are often afraid of saying that something is hard, because if we say something's hard, then it must negate all the good, right? And it's really not. And I often, in my work with our guests that come here, talking with them about how it's not an either or. It's not, it was a good experience or it was a bad experience. It was a good experience, and there were some bad experiences in your cross-cultural life. And that word "and" can be so powerful, that we're not negating all the amazing things about being a TCK or being a missionary family or living, these amazing realities of wherever you are, when you say that the hard things are hard and you miss friends and you had to say 100 goodbyes and all these hard things. We don't have to pick one or the other. It's and.
And I think as Christians too, we have a really hard time holding both of those things at the same time. And we have this tension between God is good and life is hard. But sometimes it's really hard to see that or to express that, especially with our kids. And we want to keep turning them to God is good. Yes, he absolutely is. We need to teach our kids that. And things can also be hard and really need to be processed. They don't just get wiped clean and go away because of this truth that God is good. It's a both and I think especially in the missions community, I see that be a much harder thing to grasp. I work cross sector, so I work in the missions community, but also TCKs outside of that world. And I've been surprised that there's a significant pattern in the missions community specifically of having a hard time holding both of those things together.
You mentioned I think in your first book, you talk about the ampersand life, where it is both and I love that expression because it's like, oh, because it is absolutely true. We had a great experience overseas, but we were separated from family and friends, and we had amazing experiences, but there were hard parts to it too.
And there were hard parts.
Yeah, so it's both and so I really appreciate the fact that the idea of the ampersand, and it's like I would really want to grab a hold of that. I'm thinking about painting a giant ampersand on one of our walls just to like say, just to remind us it's both and. So anyway, let's talk for a minute about raising up a generation of healthy third culture kids. I think this is probably when you were really, blogging and writing and talking with people, and you're like, yes, it's possible. It can be preventative. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, so I wrote that book because there were a lot of people telling me to, and I finally said, okay, fine, I'll write a book. And is a really easy, practical way for parents and TCK caregivers to think about, here are the TCK challenges that we see. Here's how they can manifest negatively in adulthood. And then here's how you can work to prevent that with the 4-year-old that you're working with or the 14-year-old. And trying to just take it from that perspective of let's look at where this goes if it's not proactively cared for. And then take it 10 steps back and look at how we can preventively care for that. And so I think that is a really helpful thing. I know there are, I've lost count, several organizations that have now made it a required resource for their families, which is really cool and was not anything that I had expected when I wrote it. But it's clearly hit a felt need of realizing parents need the practicality. They need to know, okay, well, what do I actually say? What do I actually do? And I'm a parent myself. I have 2 little girls. And anytime I read a parenting book, I'm always reading through the theory thinking, okay, this is great, but what do I do? How do I actually say this to my 3-year-old? And so I wrote it from that perspective too, of like, what would be the handbook that I would need as a parent of little kids?
I just was making some notes as I was reading through Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, and just some of the things that the kids need to hear from the parents. And I think something that really stood out to me was the affirmation from the parents about how important they are, how important the family is, how important the kids are, and the work is secondary, the family's the primary. Can you talk a little bit about when kids maybe, parents never intentionally say you're not as important, but a lot of times they'll do things that communicate you're not as important. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. That this is one of those things that if it's not explicitly said, it's going to be implicitly believed that that's not the case. That if you as a parent aren't explicitly saying you are more important than our work, and we're going to show you that in this way, or we have showed you that in this way, or this is why we chose this school, or whatever it is, if that's not stated by the parent and they just assume that their kid knows that, there are a lot of things in the TCK life that indicate otherwise, whether that's the intention of the parent or not. It's the fact that you have taken me out of school to move to a different country to work with different people. The work never ends because people are always knocking at the door. You clearly care about those kids who are in our house every single day more than you care about me. There's all these things that can go through your head that the parents, again, are not being intentionally neglectful of their children at all, but it's just this natural tendency to start thinking, well, my life is clearly displaying that you care about other people and serving other people more than you care about loving your own kid. And so it's so important that parents are really intentional. And I think dads, especially, it can be even harder for some reason for dads to explicitly sit down with their kids and say that. because a lot of the time maybe they're the primary missionary. Maybe they're the ones who have the role with the organization, or they're the one who's out doing a lot of the work. And sometimes it can come across that, well, mom is caring for you so well, so clearly we care about you more than our job. But for it to come from the dad is something that I think is really valuable, and maybe not as natural sometimes as it is for moms to say those things.
Yeah, I think it is really valuable to be able for TCKs to hear that they are more important, and it is, their lives have been disrupted, and it's hard for little kids to understand where do they fit, or even teenagers. Those wounds, if they're not addressed, can be pretty deep.
You also then wrote The Grief Tower, which just recently came out, which is a very much, and you say in there, it's just a practical, it's a quick read, it's a handbook, it's really a part of it's a tool in a tool chest. And you have a second version coming out soon, I think, that you're working on for adult third culture kids. So let's talk a little bit about the Grief Tower and how you kind of made reference to it already about in your own life about blocks of grief stacking up. And so will you just talk about that a little bit?
The Grief Tower, yes, came out just February 1st, 2021. And it is, my brother was joking with me that it's like the car manual for working with TCKs. So really quick, easy handbook. Yeah, exactly. I was like, that's actually really good. He said, but it's still too long for me to read. So could you just sticky note the parts that I need to go read? So I sent him a sticky noted version. But it is just a really helpful tool for what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, that a lot of the time parents don't know how to process grief with their TCKs. And this idea of grief processing, or sometimes you could use grief processing and debriefing interchangeably. This idea is that it has to be this ordeal, that we have to go to a place, we have to have an expert, we have to do all these things. And while that is helpful, and I highly recommend it, and I think it's really important, you can't just not do any grief processing because you're waiting for that to happen, or you don't think anything has been bad enough to spend the time and money to do that, or that sort of thing. And so giving them the skills to be able to look at what's on their family's grief tower, what's on each individual kid's grief tower, what are those losses and grief-inducing experiences and family crises and intense moments of fear, what are those things that have happened in the family, and then how can you proactively unstack that? So what is often talked about in the world of TCKs is this idea of unresolved grief. And so you could think of the grief tower as a bunch of unresolved grief. Well, one thing that when I was writing Raising Up a Generation of Healthy Third Culture Kids, one thing that was really bothering me was that there was all this talk about unresolved grief, but not really anybody talking about how do we resolve it. It was just kind of well, that's a bummer. There's a lot of unresolved grief in the TCK life. And so starting to think through, well, if this tower is stacking throughout their developmental years, how can we preventatively unstack it or keep it from stacking higher in the first place? And how can parents be a big part of that? And so the Grief Tower walks parents and TCK caregivers, it's written to both audiences. It walks them through how do you identify what's on it, and then how do you unstack it? So grief processing, how do you process grief with your little kids, your teenagers? How do you give them skills to do that? How do you do that for yourself if you haven't learned how to do that well yet? And that sort of thing.
So again, it's a preventative care model that empowers parents and caregivers to really do this work themselves and not wait for the expert 4 years later when they come back to their sending country.
You just mentioned in the book sometimes that the first times anyone, any TCKs even sit down and talk about this is a week before they enter college, where someone sits down and does a re-entry with them or something, and all of a sudden they've got 18 years of blocks stacked up. And I just love the fact that you're giving parents a tool to work with their kids.
And having been the TCK that went to the reentry seminar at 18 and was in a room full of kids who, for the first time in their lives, were given a chance and the permission to grieve. And we just had this huge, literally wailing session of, I mean, just the amount of emotion in that room was crazy. So to prevent that kind of like, oh, at 18, now I finally have a chance to grieve. I mean, that's a huge gift. Yeah. To be able to grieve along the way. And maybe at 18 arrived, like, I know how to do this. I know how to move into adulthood with the tools to continue to face life, because life will continue to bring grief and loss and things to mourn. And if we don't just keep shoving it away, it gives a lot of freedom. What services do you provide through TCK training?
So many. So I was reading somebody a list the other day, and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm exhausted listening to you. So I won't give you that whole list. But it falls into a couple different categories. So services for parents and then services for organizations. And then in those categories, there are things that are just like purchase and go sort of things. And then there are things that require my time, or it's an interactive sort of a situation. So for parents and organizations, the things that I have that are just kind of grab and go is a preventive TCK care video series that can be used to educate anybody about how to be a really good caregiver to TCKs, whether you're a single person going to serve overseas, maybe you're going to teach at an international school, maybe you're a parent, whoever it is, but that's a really easy resource. It also goes along with the book, so it can be a book study as well. I have family curricula, one for 4 to 12 and one for 13 to 18 that includes a teen workbook. And those really hit my heart of helping parents work through things with their own kids. It's written to parents, do this activity, have these family conversations. This one, the whole family has to be present for, those sorts of things, but just walks them through a lot of these TCK topics in really fun and easy to guide ways. I won't say that grief processing is easy, but it's easy for the parents to pick it up and know what to do at least. And then I have a lot of workshops. A lot of those are live. Those are on tcktraining.com/workshops. They can be registered for. And then the recordings of those also end up being available. So those are options as well. And then as far as debriefing, I do virtual debriefing and then in-person 2-day debriefs as well. So those are just a few things. There are more that you can find on the website, but trying to give lots of resources to make TCK care really effective and easy and really streamlined for organizations and parents.
Oh, that's great. We will link to all of this on our website when we're able to share this with everyone, and I'm excited for more and more people to find all these resources. So thank you.
So Lauren, part of our one of our goals with the podcast is trying to help people, like in a local church setting, who are receiving missionaries back from the field. And they maybe never have been missionaries themselves, but they have a heart for these families and for these singles, and they really want to care for them. And so talk to them just for a minute about things that they can not necessarily do, but things just to be aware of and things to help the family when they are, say, for 6 months or a year back in the States. Just kind of talk to those people for a minute.
Yeah, so the biggest thing for that is to not assume that the kids had a great experience, that it was really easy, that it was like a vacation, that they're happy to be home. All of these things are really easy to assume, and instead ask a lot of questions. And the very best phrase that I love using when I'm working with TCKs is, can you tell me more about that? And that just opens up so much more conversation. And especially if you are a person who maybe doesn't know the missions world very well, or you've never lived outside your passport culture, to have that curiosity, especially with the kids. I think for some reason we have a tendency to be more curious and ask more questions for the parents and the adults. But then with the kids, we just say these assumptions like, it's so great to have you home. Are you so excited to be here? And that sort of thing. But instead asking questions like, what is it like for you to come back? oh, it's okay. Can you tell me more? Can you tell me more about that? And really just hearing from them, I think is an amazing gift. And then I'll just share one thing that comes to mind in case it's helpful. But I remember in university, there was a lady who came and visited me at school. And I went out to lunch with her thinking, I don't really know how this is going to go. I was just come from Africa, went straight to university, and it was in Indiana. So we were about to have a really, really bleak winter. And she, after lunch, said, "Can I take you across the street to Kohl's and get you some winter clothes?" And I said, "No, no, no, I'm fine." She's like, "So what do you have for winter clothes?" And I said, I think I have a couple long sleeve shirts." She said, "Do you have a winter coat?" I said, "No, I have like a sweater." And so she walked me over to Kohl's and said, "Here is your budget. Get anything that you want for the winter." And that was the biggest blessing in the world because, for one, I had no idea what to expect from an Indiana winter. And two, it was somebody who wasn't just showing me care and love in a verbal way, but it was so tangible. And that is one of the like most imprinted memories from that season of my life, of somebody caring really well for me. So,
Well, I hope someone else out there can do that for another TCK in a different way.
mhm.
There are definitely TCKs out there that are coming from various different climates to college and don't know what to expect.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes a family, just simply inviting them into their family life.
Uh-huh.
Will you join us
Yeah.
for dinner? Will you, it's Thanksgiving. Do you have somewhere to go? Could you just come and spend Thanksgiving with us? Or things like that. I think those kinds of gestures are significant.
So if you could tell those who provide care for TCKs just one thing that, hey, I want you to know this, and this is the most important thing, what would it be?
That's always a hard one. I think big picture, it would be, the goal is not to be a perfect TCK caregiver or a perfect parent. It's to be aware and intentional. And when you have an awareness and you know what maybe challenges look like and you know how they manifest in adulthood and how to prevent them with young kids, that shows you how to be intentional about those things. And I think that there are a lot of really well meaning people out there who just don't have the tools. And so that awareness that can lead to intentionality is so, so important. And I think that we have we're in a really neat place because for the first time in history, we have enough information about TCKs to know this. And I think it's really important that we're intentional about implementing it.
Yeah, so being aware and kind of ready to do the work and
Yeah.
not just waiting that, oh, they'll survive it, they'll be okay.
Not assuming that children are resilient, because in some ways they are, and in many ways we know that what happens in our developmental years impacts us in adulthood, and so we cannot just not do anything on the basis of children being resilient. I can get it on a long soapbox on that one if I want, but
Yeah, that's true. And there is so much we can do. And like you were saying,
Yes.
and you provided these materials, and there's other great material out there. There are tools now, and so we have an opportunity to change the tide, perhaps, of how
Yeah.
missionary kids and their families, and I'm excited at the thought of, like you said, the rates of anxiety and depression in adult TCKs dropping. That's amazing to think that we could do this. We could equip families to really help their kids thrive.
I think several years, 30 years ago when David Pollock started talking about TCKs, right, and Ruth Van Rinken, and when they started doing interviews and so on. And I know that at that point, that was such a new thing. That was a new territory. And I know David Pollock in his career not only worked with missions, but he was often invited by embassies and military and so on. He spoke in a lot of places and had a lot of contact with people. And Lauren, I want to encourage you because I think your preventative care model is going to do the same thing. I feel like the preventative care model is breaking new ground. And I feel like it's going to have a huge influence and a huge impact. And so I want to speak words of blessing over that and what you're doing. And I'm just excited to see how that's going to go forward. And I just hope that in some little way that as we share your books with people and talk with people, that we might just play a little bit of a small role in that.
Yeah.
Thank
We hope
you
that
so much.
people who are listening to this podcast will get a chance to grab one of your books and become equipped, whether or not they are the primary caregiver for a TCK or not. Like just being someone in churches who are supporting TCKs, that they would understand who it is they're supporting. That can be a huge gift.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Lauren. We're excited about the work you're doing. And
Thank you so much.
we will be using your tools here, and excited to have families here at Sanctuary Inn be able to have some more of these preventative care tools. So.
Yeah, we have a group that's working with the TCKs when they come, and so I'm eager to pass your books on to them so that they have just more tools to work with too. So thank you for all your work.
Yes, thank you so much. It's a joy. I love every second of it.
So Steve, that was a really good time with Lauren. I really enjoyed it, and I was wondering what was something that stood out to you about our conversation.
I think I'd just go back to the whole idea of the preventative care and how significant that is, that you can equip caregivers and parents. You can give them the tools to talk about emotions, to talk about experiences, to talk about sorrow and loss and grief. You can give them all these things ahead of time. They don't have to wait until they're 18 to process all this information. They can actively process it as they're growing, as they're experiencing it, as they're transitioning from from one experience to another. Anyway, it's just amazing that, and it's going to be so healthy. It's going to be so healthy for those families and for those kids.
Yeah, I would agree. That's something that really stood out to me, is thinking about the long-term impact of preventative care and how right now there is a bit of a problem for those who work in the area of missionary care. They know that there are unfortunately quite a few TCKs that walk away from God in the midst of this process of experiencing grief and experiencing being disconnected from parents, and the conversations that aren't happening are really turning off some MKs from God. So I'm hopeful that not only these conversations and preventative care things can help missionary kids be more connected with their families, and then not blaming and angry at God perhaps for the sorrows in their lives.
Yeah.
So that excites me. And like Lauren mentioned, this could also help address anxiety and depression and just some of the mental health issues that we're seeing in adult TCKs. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, I am looking forward to Lauren just really experiencing a lot of growth in her ministry, and I think people are already recognizing how significant her ministry is. So I'm excited to recommend Lauren and what she is doing with her TCK training, and looking forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah, and you can find all the information about her ministry at her website, and the link is in our show notes.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers for kingdom purposes. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, and maybe you were prompted to pass this along to someone you know that will benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy schedules to help us learn more about missionary care.
We also want to thank Tim Downing for the music that he wrote and performed specifically for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can learn more about him and his work at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos and is produced by Tim Cowley of Cowley Visuals. If you have media needs, including film, photography, or audio, you can reach Tim at cowleyvisuals.com.
Our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Gibbons, Kara's amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website and learn more about the ministry of Sanctuary Inn at sanctuaryinn.org. Thank you again for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.
See you next time.